This year, the police budget is $448 million. The Human Service Department budget is $385 million. Fire is about $327 million, and care is $33 million. If the city is serious about building a sustainable department, we absolutely need more investment.
That's Chief Amy Barden of Seattle's Community Assisted Response and Engagement Department, or CARE, breaking down the expansion of that department in city council chambers this week, her wish list there. Why should you care about CARE? We're examining that story. Plus, democracy vouchers will be back on the ballot soon. How much are they worth to you? And why has a proposal from the governor to hire more police officers turned into such a political football in Olympia? All these stories and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. And I'm with my co-host, David Croman. And let me get David all dialed up here. David, I wanted to ask you kind of a gut check question here. Daylight savings is A, awesome because you can spend more time outside with your kids, or B, not awesome because your kids want to be outside all the time and won't go to bed. What do you got?
So far, awesome.
Okay.
Although the first couple of days are kind of tough because they don't understand that the clocks have changed. So we're still getting up at kind of the same time we were before. But I do appreciate being able to go outside after dinner with them.
Oh, I have a tough time understanding it too a lot of times. So I get where you're coming from and where they're coming from. Thank you, David. And thanks to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Find them on the first floor of City Hall. John, thanks for looking out, buddy. Thanks always to our show patrons. Andrea, or is it Andrea? No matter how you say it, you are cool. Thanks for jumping in to support the show. A Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal is headed your way. Bonus deal, we answer questions from patrons on the show. We have Patrons First podcast where you get the download first. All kinds of goodness. Please join in at just $5 a month. Finally, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get it rolling with Right Here, Right Now. Well, this week on the Seattle City Council is a week of anticipation, I guess you'd say. The full council passed a resolution on those statements of legislative intent this week that we talked about last week on the podcast. We're waiting for a big vote next week on that SODO housing plan. But one of the top issues for the council right here and now, learning about the expansion of the CARE program, Community Assisted Response and Engagement, the so-called third arm of the public safety triumvirate made up of police, fire, and CARE. David, I thought this was a really long and heartfelt breakdown from Chief Amy Barden, who mentioned that her department gets about 7% of the budget that the police department has. And when a CARE team, a non-police group of mental health experts, et cetera, addiction experts, when they're sent out to a call, it saves the city at least 50 cents on the dollar versus sending police. I guess I just hadn't heard this put into such stark economic terms before, David. What do those numbers say to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this in a lot of ways became the kind of moderated stance on policing. There was, of course, in 2020 at the peak of it, there was this sort of, quote, defund the police side of it. But on the other side was this kind of more this argument of appealing more to some people's kind of mathematical or rational side, saying, hey, police themselves are saying we're responding to a lot of calls that we don't need to. And so I think this is kind of part of that larger argument of saying, alternatives to policing exist so that A, we can free up police to do other more important things, and B, because, it's cheaper and maybe meets the needs of people a little bit better. I think it kind of falls into that bucket, which is, if you can't always make a sort of philosophical argument, I guess, for why there is a logical replacement on some calls for police, then maybe you can make a kind of rational mathematical one. And it seems like that's what this one is.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking behind this at the big challenge here, David. According to Chief Barden, Seattle still has this co-dispatch model in place, meaning Seattle police have to accompany CARE teams on every call. And the chief says she is hearing from rank and file officers in the SPD, oh, no, why do we have to do this, even with clear evidence that these officers are not needed on these calls? Do you see a day when CARE gets this solo dispatch type situation without police sent with them? Because I got to say, the data seems to be pushing the conversation that way. And I think a few members of the council might be thinking about that as well after the meeting in the Public Safety Committee this week.
Yeah, I think it could push that way, although of course there has not been as much momentum around sort of systemic changes to law enforcement lately as there were in the last few years. And to make it happen, my understanding is there would need to be some more tweaks to the contract language
The
to
contract
kind
language
of really
for
open.
SPOG, the Police Officers Guild, right?
Yeah, the Seattle Police Officers Guild. That's right, to allow that to happen. And then, I think we've talked about this before. For that to really be effective, it kind of depends on a smarter and better informed dispatch system
Hmm.
because, you can look at statistics, they're all over the map, but of how many calls didn't require a police officer.
Yep.
And a lot of people point to those and say, hey, look, we could be replacing all these calls with non-police officers.
Yep.
But all of those are sort of retrospective. Like it's in after the fact, they said, well, maybe
Yeah.
we didn't need a police officer to this,
Okay.
but it's harder to know that in advance that a police officer doesn't need to be there. And, I think in the presentation it said only 3 care calls they needed backup, which is a low
Right.
number. But if you do this enough, there's the risk that eventually a care person is going to be in a situation they should not be. And I think there's a lot of conservatism around not letting that happen because that would
Yeah.
be sort of disastrous if somebody needed a police officer and didn't get one, or a care person was in an unsafe situation without a police officer. And so I think the goal and the hope is you could get to the point where you just have non-police show up and kind of handle the situation. But getting
Because
there,
other
I think
cities are
is,
doing that with their care similar type of programs.
yeah, no, right. But I think sort of scaling it up in Seattle will take
Mm.
some doing and get to the point where they haven't. It doesn't feel like they're particularly close to that, but
Yeah.
maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, we'll see. I think it's going to be an interesting part of the budget discussion later on this year. I know that Chief Barden was saying, hey, if there is some savings from some of these police officers, why couldn't we turn it into more care team units? So there's always a political fight over those dollars in police salary savings. So we'll see where this one goes. But I wanted to move on, David, and touch on a piece that you ran last week about a challenger for Council President Sarah Nelson with her citywide position 9 seat up for a vote this fall. Dion Foster has entered as a candidate, a former policy advisor for the city of Seattle, currently the director of the nonprofit Progress Alliance of Washington. There's just not a lot of action in this race. Foster so far is the only opponent for Nelson. The deadline for candidates to apply is May 9th. And I thought you went through a good round of questions with Foster. She doesn't want to get pushed into a progressive label, though she does work for a more left-leaning organization, and a lot of local politicos that are on the left side are definitely supporting her. But I'm even more interested in this question of why do you think we haven't heard from more candidates in this race or many of the others outside of city attorney in District 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think unlike an open race, there's always going to be fewer candidates when challenging an incumbent.
Hmm.
And I think there was with Nelson probably a sense of the kind of establishment trying to find that person who would be their challenger.
Okay.
Um, I mean, I guess my sense is it's going to take because Sarah Nelson is well established. I think she's going to continue to have pretty strong backing from business,
Mm-hmm.
and so to put a real challenge behind her, I think will require a person who is well connected and well resourced, and
Yeah.
so. More people. It's fairly easy to get into races, so I'm surprised that more kind of uh, there's maybe not a bigger crowd, but
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
far as somebody kind of filling that role as the clear front runner to take her to the general election, I think there was just maybe a sense of trying to be a little patient and find who that person was. And
Yeah.
in Dion Foster, who has a fairly compelling resume and um, is being represented, I believe, by Northwest Passages, which is like kind of one of the highest profile political consultant
Ah,
firms in
okay.
Seattle. Comes out of the gate with a strong list of endorsements. I
Mm-hmm.
imagine will raise pretty significant money. That is then kind of filling this role of strong backer. And so now suddenly you've
Okay.
got, Nelson's going to get through the general almost guaranteed. There's this other strong, well-financed person. It looks a little more narrow for kind of other candidates to get in.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw a report on KUOW about some of the candidates that are jumping into the mayor's race, and there was a little line right at the end that said Katie Wilson from the Transit Riders Union, which is a progressive group, folks, that works with transit and other social justice issues. They said she would soon be throwing her hat in the ring for the mayor's race. A recognizable name and face there, David. I've talked to her a number of times over the years, and one that comes across as maybe the most legitimate candidate in that mayor's race outside of Bruce Harrell. Do you think she has a shot if she ends up committing to this?
I don't know. It would be a long shot, and I think she would and will be the first to acknowledge that she's the underdog in this race. And I would say Harrell has done a pretty good job at at locking down some of the political lanes that would make sense for a challenger. He has consolidated a lot of labor support that maybe went more towards Lorena Gonzalez in his first race.
Right.
Some of that has to do with the very friendly contract that city unions got. And so there's that. You have Congressperson Pramila Jayapal endorsing Harrell. So he has some kind of progressive cred there too.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
it's sort of a narrow window, but I think the key takeaway, and I expect Katie to talk about this when she does announce, is that looking at the social housing vote, for
Yes,
example,
right.
you had a lot of the
Which Harold
political,
did not bring up in his state of the city. Keep going.
yeah, exactly. You had a lot of the political establishment, Harrell included, backing this sort of Chamber of Commerce backed option to direct budget from the city's existing coffers to fund the social housing developer.
Mm-hmm.
And not as many voices out kind of backing the more progressive one, which is a tax on companies that pay their employees over $1 million.
Right.
But despite that kind of political establishment lining up behind the first option that I mentioned, the second option got blown out of the water. And so
Yeah.
I think the conversation will be, hey, Harrell maybe actually does have some weaknesses here, and the sense of his inevitable reelection, I think, was tested a little bit by that social housing vote, because whether it was up to him or not, his face was on all of the flyers
Yep.
and in favor of the option for spending existing sources on social housing, and yet it didn't seem to make any difference. And so I think Katie Wilson's argument is going to be, hey, I'm the voice of the other side of this, that we need to be
Yeah.
taxing rich people and corporations more to build housing.
Right. Interested to see that. Okay. Well, up next, an experiment in government by the people that got its start in Seattle. We're talking about democracy vouchers and the new levy effort to support them. More coming up next on Now Hear This. Seattle's democracy voucher program, one of a kind in our country, is up for a renewal this year, and Mayor Bruce Harrell is asking for voter support. Pending council approval, you will see this measure on your ballot in August, a 10-year, $45 million measure to keep this program running. That's up from $30 million when democracy vouchers began in 2015, but when adjusted for inflation, it's actually not that much more. Mayor Harrell says these vouchers, which help more candidates run for office by opening up that donor pool, is an investment voters should support.
Democracy vouchers as a tool have allowed more people to participate in campaign financing in our city, making the political process more accessible and inclusive. And indeed, that is its intent, and that is how it has worked out in the last 10 years.
David, you wrote about this. The mayor talked about it. As of 2017, 106,000 people have contributed a total of $10 million to local campaigns using these democracy vouchers, which has led to more diverse candidates and certainly more diverse races. But I have that nagging question of, are they really working? Because you wrote this number, and I was amazed to see it. Less than 5% of Seattle voters are actually turning in their vouchers and participating in this program. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing to get people to vote, but it's another to kind of get people to wrap their heads around what these pieces of paper are. I think most people, my guess, and I don't know this, is that most of those who have contributed did so when a candidate maybe came to their door
Sure,
or saw
right.
them at a farmer's market and directly asked them for it. I think a lot of people maybe don't think to put them in the mail or drop them in, send them to a specific candidate. And so
Yep.
it's just, a few too many steps and just complicated enough that I think maybe that is kind of suppressing it a little bit.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, the number has dropped in recent years. That I think the peak was close to 8% of
Yeah.
people, and now it's down under 5%. you, you could come up with your own theories about why that is. I know total participation in the last election was down, but this is even as a percentage of that is smaller. So,
Yeah.
it is lagging a little bit, but I think the kind of main piece that the argument in favor of keeping it is that I think it does genuinely allow candidates who are maybe not as well connected to run because it gives them an avenue to raise money if they're just
Yeah.
willing to put in the shoe leather for it. Whether or not those people ever actually make it out of primary and are elected is another question. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but it does sort of reward shoe leather
Hmm.
campaigning to an extent, and makes it so people who maybe don't have big checkbooks are worth petitioning.
Yeah, yeah. And I've been with candidates when they've done that, had the democracy vouchers with them at the door. It's like, oh, you didn't have yours? Don't worry, I've got some right here. So, yeah, that's definitely
Yeah.
something that candidates do door to door. But going back to that big money piece, the other point I thought you really nailed home in your article was this idea that when these vouchers were first on the scene in 2015, it was at least partly in response to the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which enabled corporations and these other outside groups to spend unlimited money on elections. But those independent expenditures, so-called dark money that isn't officially tied to any candidate, have really blown up over the past decade in Seattle. I wanted to ask what that tells you.
Yeah, I don't, it's hard to say, hard to totally prove cause and effect here. I
Mm-hmm.
guess if the goal of the program was to get rid of that dark money, it has not succeeded. Some people, when this was being proposed, posited that in fact this would drive more money toward PACs and independent
Yeah,
expenditures because, it introduced a cap on how much people could donate to formal campaigns and how much
yeah,
campaigns could raise. And so therefore, the theory was that it would incentivize more spending on the side.
yeah,
I don't, I think it's hard to prove that it is in fact the democracy voucher program that has driven that explosion in independent expenditures, but it has been an explosion. I think the first election after they were, or the first election that they were instituted, I think independent expenditures basically doubled from the election before. And,
mm-hmm.
I think it was 2019, they hit $4.5 million, which was
Right,
many times what it had been before.
mm-hmm.
Um, my gut says that that's more just the result of kind of a general influence of big money in U.S. politics and sort of the perception, particularly on the part of business and
Yeah,
unions to an extent, that these elections are kind of more existential. I just think businesses uh, have not done as well in recent years, and so have therefore spent more to try and elect their certain candidates. But we can say definitively that it certainly has not gotten big money out of politics.
yeah. I'm really interested to see how that impacts the run that we're going to see from so many different candidates. You think about it, we've got two citywide council races. We've got the District 2 race, which is wide open. Mark Solomon running again. You've got the mayor, you've got the city attorney. So for an odd number year here, we've got a lot of activity that's coming up this fall, which looking forward to it. That's going to be a good discussion around all those candidates. I did want to talk about some interesting politics in action for the city attorney in particular this week. Ann Davison has announced she is hiring more staff to deal with an announcement she made last week to join the lawsuit filed by Portland, San Francisco, and several other cities against the White House. This suit comes after threats of withholding federal funding to certain jurisdictions. This is related to police and how they're cooperating with federal immigration officers. And David, I thought this was interesting because Davison, even though she's in a nonpartisan position as city attorney, she became a Republican during Trump's first term. A lot of people have talked about that in Seattle. She even ran as a Republican for the lieutenant governor job in 2020. And Davison didn't join this lawsuit as soon as King County did, for example. I wanted to just ask you what you make of what Davison is trying to do here politically by joining this suit.
Yeah, well, we had written about this actually the few days after King County had joined, and she said she was planning to join. So, and then it was a few weeks before this official announcement came out. So, I don't really know what the delay was there. Probably interesting to follow up on why it took so long to officially join.
Mm,
Um, but you're right. When you talk to her, she's not, of course, as strident in her criticisms of the Trump administration as say some, maybe Pete Holmes was when he
that's a
was the
good way
city
to put it.
attorney.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, her argument is again is kind of a rational one around resources. Hey, our police is strapped. Even if we wanted to, we wouldn't have the officers to help ICE conduct these deportations, and so
Yeah.
therefore it's unfair for the Trump administration to penalize us for that. It's a little bit more of a softened pushback, I'd say, on the Trump administration. She also has said that she, won't go after any hypotheticals at city attorney. She's only going to react to things that are actually happening.
Right.
So that is all interesting. There's the cynic in me that thinks she's ramping this up a little bit because it's an election year, and already some of her opponents have brought this up as a criticism that she's not the person who should be in charge during the Trump administration. She, pushes back on that and has said that she's kind of trying to stay up to date on this. And I think this announcement of new staffing is evidence that she does intend to take it seriously, Seattle's relationship to the Trump administration. Whether you want to read that cynically or not, I'll leave up to you.
Fair, fair. It's always so interesting to me to see how political party leaders can play such a big role in these nonpartisan elections. I think back to support from all the city's Democrat district groups. That was a huge reason why Councilmember Rink won her citywide seat so handily. Do you see this playing out a little bit more in Seattle's 2025 elections, the influence of these different Democratic districts all around the city?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I frankly am a skeptic about how much of a difference those make.
Mm.
Um, they certainly think they're very important.
Ah.
I don't know that the sort of general. I mean, I'll say this that if you do win the support of a 37th
Sure,
legislative district
right.
Democrats or whatever it might be, you get some benefit from that. They might send out mailers for you and door knock. So there is sort of a tangible benefit. I don't know, like you said, I don't know that Davison got any backing before she was elected,
Sure,
and
right.
that didn't tend to matter.
Mhm.
So it can't hurt anybody. I'll say that much.
Okay. I'm interested to see how that goes. I thought that was an interesting part of the Rink campaign, and I wonder if that strategy is going to be something she'll use again this year. We shall see. More ahead on that. Well, coming up, a plan to hire more cops that started as a favorite for state Republicans has turned into something many of them might rather avoid. We'll discuss an interesting story from our state capital coming up on What's Next. An interesting twist in Olympia in progress right now over police hiring. So, Governor Ferguson has said he wants $100 million in state funding for police hiring in this biennium and the next one. So, over the next 4 years here. And he said he would veto any budget that doesn't have that money set aside. You may have heard the stat that our state has the lowest officer to resident ratio in the country. Ferguson wants to change that. Democrats have responded with the bill with support from the Legislative Black Caucus, that is House Bill 2015. And it says, okay, let's hire more officers, but let's make sure there are more social services in the mix too. And here's the twist. The bill would allow cities and counties to implement a new 0.1% sales tax dedicated to criminal justice without voter approval. The Washington State Standard has reported on this, showing that it would bring in $276 million for local governments in this biennium, as much as $595 million in the next. To get the funding, agencies would have to adopt certain use of force policies and make sure they're complying with the Keep Washington Working Act, which is that one we've been talking about. This prohibits local police from helping federal authorities directly with immigration enforcement outside of criminal cases here. The Senate version of this bill, David, does not go as far, would not involve a new sales tax, but I just wanted to get your take on this. What started as kind of like a slam dunk piece of legislation for state Republicans has become a lot more complicated here. What do you make of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think this is the kind of reality of the current budget situation too, is when there's not as much of it to go around, you have some more ideological splits like this. And Governor Ferguson himself has kind of established some of that divide from some member of his own caucus by saying he didn't want to pursue a wealth tax.
Right.
He wants cuts to the budget. So, at the same time, I think this is a bit of cover for Democrats who are both in a position where, it's no longer 2020. I think pretty much I would say most elected officials, including Democrats, are now in the camp of trying to hire more police officers. But at the same time, there is still this sort of lingering concern about whether police officers are always the right people to do it.
Right.
And so this is sort of gives cover to the caucuses that maybe are still uneasy about a purely police response. So supplement it with something different.
Yeah.
Of course, Republicans are going to be happy to jump all over Democrats anytime they propose a sales, any kind of tax hike.
Yeah.
Sales tax is already pretty tough on people. It's kind of the most regressive tax you can have, and in a state where we're already considered among the most regressive states in the country as far as taxation goes. So, not a slam dunk at all.
No, I guess I wanted to look at that too. You talk about the dollars and how they're spent. Is a 0.1% tax something that's actually going to make a difference? I know it can to some families, but I think about this and the money it might generate. Some of the smaller jurisdictions out there, I've been reading about this. They're saying, hey, you're kind of spreading the peanut butter a little thin here. I don't even know if this is going to make a difference for our department. Do you get a sense of that too?
Yeah, no, that's a good point too, because right, 270 million sounds like a lot, but how much is that?
Until you spread it across 39 counties. Yeah.
Right. And I think if you ask a lot of the counties, including in some of a lot of the conservative places of Washington, what they'd really prefer is being allowed to have their property taxes more in line with inflation, which is the kind of Tim Eyman led 1% cap. That's really the thing that the counties would want. I'm sure they would not say no to a 0.1% sales tax bump, but it's not what they see they need to be really solvent.
Yeah, it's just one of these kind of debates that I didn't think it was going towards this sales tax piece at all, but it really did turn into that. And I'm interested to see what happens next with this, because so many of the state Republicans, they just put out a package, if you didn't see it earlier this week, folks, that really talked about, all right, we're going to have a reasonable amount of cuts. We're not going to put in new taxes here. And so this is going to be a battle for the legislature over the next several weeks here. Their session is supposed to wrap up on April 27th. I know a lot of them have said that if we start getting Medicare cuts at the federal level, we could be pushing into a special session. So we're going to try to keep an eye on all those different things here, because there's a lot cooking in Olympia right now that I know the city of Seattle is looking at as well. So we'll keep an eye on that. As I say, I did need to wrap up with you here, David. And I saw you post about this recently. The new quarterback the Seahawks picked up, Sam Darnold. Turns out he had an awesome year for the Minnesota Vikings. Kind of choked in the playoffs. I'm not sure how we'll do here, but he had a very good year last year. Hopefully we get that guy. But it did have me thinking, is the month of March just waiting for spring training to be done and baseball to begin, maybe getting distracted by March Madness a little bit? Why does this seem like the longest month of the baseball season to me? Help me out, man.
Yeah, because you're just kind of holding your breath, hoping nobody gets hurt.
Right.
Stumbles to April 1st. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's right before. I'm not a big basketball guy or a hockey guy. I like football and baseball, and neither of those are happening right now. And although I will say that at least spring training, you kind of still live in that optimistic space where anything is possible. And who knows with this Mariners team. But right now it feels nice to be optimistic. But once they actually start playing, I have to confront reality.
I know. I'm going to put it off for another couple weeks. We got another couple until they actually get the bats cracking in regular season games. But we shall see. Again, the month of March can't get done soon enough. We've got to get this baseball season started. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. Andrea, I will be in touch. Thank you for bringing in your support this week. Very much appreciated there. If you are not a patron, please do support the show for as low as $5 a month, more if you would like. You can do that on Patreon. Find us there. That would be greatly appreciated. You can also hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Make that download happen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.